When I first drove into my new neighborhood, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of excitement and nervousness, the kind that tightens your stomach and makes your palms sweat just a little, because moving to a new place always comes with that fresh start thrill. But this was different somehow. I had heard the whispers from the neighbors before even signing the lease, the little warnings tossed casually in conversation like, "Oh, you'll see how the HOA operates here," or "They don't mess around with rules, so watch out." And at first I laughed it off, thinking, well, rules are rules and who cares, right? But the closer I got to my house, the more I noticed how meticulous everything was. From perfectly trimmed lawns to freshly painted fences that all seemed to gleam under the afternoon sun. And though part of me appreciated the beauty and order, another part of me wondered, who enforces all of this? Will I get a letter if I leave a leaf out of place? My mind raced with scenarios of stern HOA officers knocking at my door, clipboards in hand, ready to scold me for some tiny infraction I didn't even know existed, and I admit, that thought made me hesitate just a little as I pulled into the driveway. But the house itself was charming, a small, cozy place that seemed to hum with possibilities, and I shook off the anxiety, telling myself that maybe, just maybe, the HOA stories were exaggerated. The first evening was quiet, almost suspiciously quiet, and as I unpacked boxes and tried to get a feel for the space, I noticed a neatly folded envelope tucked under my doormat. My heart skipped a beat. I thought, oh no, is this a warning already? Did I break some invisible rule just by parking my car the wrong way in my own driveway? I picked it up cautiously, half expecting some passive-aggressive note about lawn decorations or paint colors, but instead it was a welcome letter, hand-signed by the HOA president, introducing themselves, giving a few tips about the neighborhood, like where to recycle, which streets tended to flood during heavy rain, and even offering their contact information if I ever needed help with anything, which instantly threw me off because I had been expecting admonishment, not guidance. The letter even mentioned a small welcome gathering they hosted for new residents every month, inviting me personally to come meet neighbors, and as I read through it, my stomach eased a little, replaced with a flicker of curiosity. Was it possible that these people were actually genuinely trying to be helpful? That night I couldn't sleep much, my mind buzzing with both relief and lingering doubt, imagining the stories I had been told, clashing with the simple act of kindness in that letter. And I found myself replaying every encounter on the way to my house. Every glance from neighbors, wondering if I had misjudged the whole community, if maybe there was more than just rules and regulations behind those neatly trimmed hedges. The next morning I ventured out with a coffee in hand, trying to act casual, pretending to take in the neighborhood for the first time. And that's when it happened. A neighbor waved at me from across the street, someone I hadn't even met yet, and she smiled warmly, offering a quick tip about which local store had the freshest bread, how the delivery drivers preferred to park, and even warning me about a tricky pothole near the corner. I nodded along, pleasantly surprised, and before I could say anything else, another neighbor came over, carrying a small potted plant, saying it was a tradition in this neighborhood to welcome newcomers with something green for their home. And it was such a small gesture, but it felt enormous, like a crack in the wall of suspicion I had built up in my head. And it made me wonder if all those warnings about the HOA being harsh, controlling or cold were just stories, exaggerations passed along from neighbor to neighbor. I couldn't shake a creeping sense of curiosity, like I had stumbled into a place where appearances were misleading, where rules might exist not to punish but to protect, where people who seemed strict on paper could be quietly caring when it mattered most. And as I unpacked the rest of my things that day, arranging furniture and trying to get comfortable, I found myself glancing out the window more than once, noticing the way a couple of HOA members were helping an elderly resident fix a gate that had come loose, chatting cheerfully as they worked, offering guidance and support, not criticism or scolding, and I realized I had no idea what I had expected. But it certainly wasn't this, people being genuinely kind without expecting anything in return. By the time the sun started to dip behind the houses, casting a warm golden glow over the street, I felt a strange combination of relief and intrigue, the tension in my shoulders loosening as I thought, maybe this place isn't like the stories at all. Maybe this HOA isn't a villain waiting in the wings, but a hidden ally. quietly making sure everyone has what they need. And as I sat on my porch sipping the last of my coffee, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation for what was to come. Because if the first impressions were anything to go by, my experience with this neighborhood and its HOA was only just beginning, and somehow, I had a feeling it was going to be far more surprising than I ever could have imagined. The next morning, I woke up to another envelope on my doorstep, and my first instinct was to groan and brace myself for some stern reprimand about a minor infraction I hadn't even noticed. But as I tore it open, I realized my assumptions were probably the only thing in my head that was wrong, because inside was a neatly typed note from the HOA thanking me for moving in and offering a few practical tips about the neighborhood, like which streets tended to get icy in winter, which local plumbers were reliable, and even a reminder about a community garden that was open to all residents. And instead of irritation or threat, there was warmth and a kind, almost fatherly tone that I didn't expect from a group that I had been primed to fear. I found myself reading it twice, half disbelieving, half amused, because it was almost as if someone had peeked into my thoughts and decided to put all the rumors I had heard to rest with simple kindness. And yet, that same day, I started noticing small things that made me pause, little details around the neighborhood that didn't quite fit the picture of an unforgiving HOA I had built in my mind. A freshly shoveled walkway in front of a neighbor's house, even though there wasn't an obligation. A note left for someone about a tree branch that looked dangerous, and the subtle way neighbors exchanged smiles and nods in passing that felt less like casual greetings and more like quiet understanding. Like everyone was keeping an eye out for each other without ever being intrusive or overbearing. And I couldn't help but wonder if maybe the stories about HOAs being rigid, controlling enforcers were just exaggerated tales from people who had never experienced the behind-the-scenes side of things. As I walked down the street to check the mailbox, a couple of HOA board members were there, seemingly inspecting the sidewalks. But instead of the cold, formal energy I had imagined, they greeted me with genuine smiles, asking if I had settled in okay and if there was anything I needed help with. And one of them even offered to lend me a ladder if I wanted to hang a few lights outside, which caught me completely off guard because I had been bracing for criticism, not assistance. And as I hesitated, trying to formulate a polite refusal, another neighbor appeared with a box of freshly baked cookies, saying it was a tradition in this neighborhood for newcomers to receive a little welcome treat. And I realized my brain was still caught in the loop of fear and suspicion, expecting some kind of strict enforcement, when in reality, everyone I met that morning seemed genuinely invested in making me feel comfortable and included, which only deepened the sense of curiosity about what was really going on behind the scenes with this HOA. That evening, while arranging a few remaining boxes in my living room, I noticed the faint sound of voices outside and peeked through the window to see a small group of people gathered at the community park down the street, including some of the same HOA members I had seen earlier, handing out bottled water and blankets to a couple of elderly residents who had been struggling with a broken heating system. And it hit me in a way I wasn't expecting. These weren't people simply enforcing rules or making sure the neighborhood looked perfect. They were actively taking care of the residents, quietly solving problems that most of us wouldn't even notice. And I felt a pang of guilt for ever doubting them based on old stereotypes or neighborhood gossip. Because here, kindness was not just a token gesture, it was a way of life, carefully woven into everything they did. And even though I had only lived here for a day, I could already feel a shift in my perception, a slow dismantling of the mental wall I had built between me and the HOA. The next morning brought yet another surprise when a friendly board member knocked on my door personally, offering to help me set up my mailbox so it was secure and properly aligned with the rest of the street, explaining that it was a minor detail, but one that mattered for both safety and aesthetic reasons. And as we worked together, chatting about local events, schools, and community initiatives, I noticed a subtle pride in their demeanor, not in a bossy or arrogant way, but in a we really care about this neighborhood kind of way. And the more I saw, the more I realized that every rule, every guideline, every seemingly strict instruction might have been designed not to control, but to protect and connect people, to create a space where everyone feels safe, included, and supported. By the time I closed the door behind me that afternoon, I was laughing to myself, thinking about all the warnings I had taken seriously before moving here, the ominous rumors and cautionary tales that had made me hesitant for weeks, and how absurd it all seemed now in light of the quiet acts of care I had witnessed. The letters, the cookies, the impromptu assistance, the community gestures, all tiny pieces of a much bigger picture that no one had bothered to explain to me until I experienced it firsthand. And for the first time, I felt genuinely curious about what other surprises this neighborhood and its HOA might have in store. What other layers of unexpected kindness might reveal themselves as I settled in. And even though I still didn't know exactly what the future held, there was a sense of excitement mixed with a calm reassurance, because if the first 2 days were any indication, the HOA wasn't just an authority to fear, it might just be the most unexpectedly supportive part of this entire experience. And that thought lingered in my mind as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, ready to rest, yet unable to stop thinking about the small acts of generosity I had already witnessed, wondering what the next day would bring and how much more this neighborhood could surprise me. A few days later, I thought I had everything under control, that I had finally settled into the rhythm of the neighborhood and figured out this supposedly strict HOA. But then, just as I was hanging up a few decorative lights along my porch for the first time, I noticed a small envelope slipped under my door once again, and my heart sank a little, because old habits die hard, and I instantly assumed the worst. That somehow, despite my careful efforts, I had already broken some obscure rule, and sure enough, my mind raced through every possible scenario. Maybe the lights were too bright, maybe the string was too long, maybe the HOA had a regulation about where outdoor decorations could be placed, and I almost hesitated to open it, afraid of the words I might read, picturing a formal letter demanding immediate changes, fines or reprimands. But as I unfolded the note, my tension dissolved almost instantly. It was not a scolding, but a friendly reminder from one of the board members suggesting a slightly better placement for the lights. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because the adjustment would prevent any accidental tripping hazards for passers-by and also enhance the curb appeal of the entire street. And as I read it, I couldn't help but smile, realizing that my worst fears had been completely unfounded, replaced instead with genuine concern for safety and aesthetics. And it struck me how unusual this was, how different from the picture of the rigid, unfeeling HOA I had imagined for weeks. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to respond with a quick thank you note tucked into their mailbox. And the very next day, the same board member appeared at my door in person, not to reprimand me or lecture me, but simply to help me adjust the lights, sharing tips about how to secure them safely for wind and rain, even offering to lend me a ladder so I wouldn't have to stretch dangerously. And as we worked together, chatting about local events and sharing small neighborhood stories, I began to notice little things I had never expected from an HOA. The way their focus was not on punishment, but on guidance, on making sure everyone could enjoy their home without accidents or unnecessary stress, and I realized my initial assumptions had been completely off. Later that afternoon, as I stepped outside to admire the neatly aligned lights, I noticed a neighbor peeking over from across the street, waving with a friendly smile and commenting on how the arrangement looked perfect now, and I felt a warm sense of inclusion, as if I had just been gently inducted into a community that cared more about connection than control. And that evening, I spotted another small act that deepened the feeling. The HOA president quietly helping an older couple carry in their groceries, chatting with them in a way that was both attentive and respectful, making sure they were comfortable before moving on. And I thought about how many times I had heard horror stories about HOA members barging in, issuing fines or acting like bureaucratic overlords, and yet here, before my eyes, was a completely different reality, one filled with empathy, consideration, and human warmth. A few days after that, another situation arose that tested my nerves. A tree branch in my backyard had snapped during a storm, dangling precariously over the fence and blocking part of my walkway, and I immediately assumed I would be on my own to deal with it. Picturing late-night phone calls and frustrated emails to the HOA demanding proof that I had secured the property, but instead a neighbor called me first to warn me about the danger, and shortly after, 2 HOA members arrived with gloves, saws, and a careful plan, not to lecture me for leaving it unattended, but to help remove it safely, working alongside me until the branch was gone, and even giving advice on how to prevent similar problems in the future. And as we worked, one of them joked about how they had been known to save backyards more than issue fines, and I laughed genuinely, realizing that this organization I had dreaded was actively invested in my safety and comfort. That evening, while sitting on my porch with a cup of tea, I reflected on how much my perspective had shifted in such a short time. Thinking back to the initial fears, the rumors, the mental checklist of all the ways an HOA could make life miserable, and now seeing that in practice, the HOA's role was almost the opposite. They were guides, helpers, and sometimes even guardians for everyone in the neighborhood, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of shame for having judged them before experiencing their true character, because the concern, the thoughtfulness, and the subtle support I had witnessed went far beyond any rule enforcement. It was about community, about making sure each resident could feel secure, comfortable, and included. By the end of that week, I found myself interacting with them more confidently, asking questions about local services, sharing small concerns, and receiving detailed, friendly guidance rather than curt responses. And I realized that the tension I had felt in my first days had completely transformed into curiosity and appreciation, a desire to learn more about how this HOA operated behind the scenes, what other unexpected ways they might assist, and how far their genuine care extended into the neighborhood. And as I turned off the porch light and glanced at the neatly trimmed lawns surrounding my house, illuminated by the soft glow of my newly secured lights, I felt a sense of anticipation, wondering what other surprises lay ahead, what small but meaningful ways this HOA would continue to show that even the most feared authority could be kind, supportive, and unexpectedly good, and I couldn't wait to see it all unfold. Because the next chapter of my life here promised to challenge every preconceived notion I had ever held about what an HOA could really be. A week into living here, I started noticing patterns that didn't quite make sense if the HOA were just strict rule enforcers. Little details that caught my attention and made me pause, like how one of the board members would quietly check in on a neighbor's mailbox during rainy afternoons, making sure the letters weren't getting soaked, or how another would leave subtle reminders for people to secure trash bins before windy days, not as punishment, but as a way to protect property and keep the neighborhood safe. And my curiosity grew so much that I started asking questions, trying to understand why they did these things. And one afternoon, as I watered the small flower bed in front of my house, one of the HOA members stopped by, introduced himself, and sensing my genuine interest, invited me to walk with him through the neighborhood, explaining that there were reasons behind every guideline and every rule that sometimes didn't make sense until you saw the bigger picture. And as we strolled, I noticed them pointing out little acts of care, a repaired fence post that prevented an elderly dog from escaping, a hand-painted curb marking that warned drivers near a blind corner, and even a set of donated bicycles being cleaned up for kids whose families couldn't afford them. And all the while, he explained how the HOA prioritized safety, community spirit, and support over just enforcing regulations, revealing that much of the organization's energy went into quietly helping residents without ever needing recognition or thanks. And I couldn't help but feel both amazed and guilty, because I had built up an entire narrative of suspicion and fear in my mind. Yet here was evidence that my assumptions were completely wrong. As we continued down the streets, he shared stories of past incidents that had shaped their approach, like the time a storm had knocked out power and flooded several basements, and the HOA had coordinated volunteers to check on every house, deliver emergency supplies, and make sure no one was left alone or in danger. And suddenly, the seemingly minor rules about fences, lights, and landscaping made sense. They weren't arbitrary. They were preventive measures designed to protect everyone and prevent accidents before they could happen. And I started realizing that what I had interpreted as strictness was actually a subtle form of care, a way to maintain not just order, but a living, breathing, interconnected community where each resident's well-being mattered. My mind was spinning, and I asked him about the rumors I had heard before moving in, the stories about HOA members being harsh or overbearing, and he laughed softly, shaking his head, explaining that people often remembered the few negative encounters more than the countless quiet acts of kindness. And that perception often overshadowed reality, which was why newcomers were often wary at first. But over time, as they witnessed the care firsthand, they usually adjusted and began to appreciate the system that had been quietly protecting them all along. By the time we looped back to my house, I was noticing things I had never seen before. A small sign in someone's yard thanking the HOA for installing better street lighting, a carefully repaired sidewalk curb that prevented accidents, even a mailbox secured with extra care for a family that had recently welcomed a newborn. And each detail made me feel like I was slowly peeling back a layer of mystery to discover the heart of the neighborhood. A place where people weren't motivated by authority or control, but by compassion. And I realized that my initial fear and skepticism were giving way to genuine curiosity, to a desire to understand how much unseen effort went into creating a safe, welcoming space. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I reflected on the walk, replaying every story and every small act I had witnessed, and I felt a sense of admiration I hadn't expected, combined with a growing desire to participate, to be part of something bigger than myself, because this HOA wasn't just an organization, it was a network of people who quietly looked out for one another. And the rules that once seemed rigid were actually lifelines designed to protect residents and maintain harmony. And as I washed the dishes, I found myself smiling at the thought of tomorrow, wondering what else I might discover, how else the HOA's compassion would reveal itself, and whether the next surprise might be even more extraordinary than the last. Because if 1 week could completely change my perception, I couldn't imagine the full story waiting to unfold as I became more involved and more aware of the quiet, kind-hearted work happening behind the scenes, and that sense of anticipation lingered as I sat by the window, watching the sun set over the neatly lined houses, realizing for the first time that I was living somewhere far more special than I had ever imagined, and that the HOA, the entity I had feared and doubted, might just be the heart of it all, a hidden force of generosity, care, and unexpected goodness. A few weeks later, I faced a situation I never could have anticipated, one of those moments that tests your nerves and patience in a way nothing else can, when a sudden plumbing issue caused a leak in my kitchen ceiling, sending water dripping dangerously close to my appliances and leaving me panicking about potential damage, insurance claims, and the nightmare of trying to find a reliable plumber on such short notice. And for a fleeting second, my mind went to the old assumptions I had carried about this HOA. Was I going to receive a letter accusing me of negligence for letting my property fall into disrepair? Or worse, would they ignore me entirely because they only cared about enforcing rules, not helping people in real crises? But then, before I could spiral further, I heard a knock at my door, and to my surprise it was 2 HOA members, not with clipboards and reprimands, but with toolboxes and calm smiles, asking if I was okay and if they could help assess the damage. And as I stepped aside to let them in, I realized that everything I had assumed about them being harsh or uncaring had been completely wrong, because their focus wasn't on blame, it was on solving the problem, on making sure I and my home were safe. And as we examined the leak together, one of them offered to contact a trusted local plumber on my behalf, while the other suggested temporary measures to prevent further flooding, all the while explaining each step patiently, so I understood exactly what was happening, and I felt a mix of relief and astonishment, realizing that I had just been granted a kind of support I had never expected from an HOA, a team that didn't just maintain rules, but genuinely cared for its residents in practical, hands-on ways. While the plumber was on his way, the HOA members stayed with me, helping to move furniture away from the dripping ceiling, placing towels and buckets strategically to minimize damage, and chatting in a friendly, reassuring tone that made the whole stressful situation feel manageable instead of overwhelming. And at one point, one of them even joked about how leaks were nature's way of keeping us humble, which made me laugh nervously, the tension in my chest easing for the first time since the water started dripping, and I couldn't help but notice how smoothly they coordinated everything without any drama, as if this kind of hands-on care was routine for them, part of a philosophy I was only now beginning to understand. By the time the plumber arrived, he was already greeted with a clear explanation of the problem and a recommendation for the fastest, safest fix, all thanks to the HOA's prior coordination. And I watched stunned as they spoke with him like seasoned pros, making sure the work would be done efficiently. While still keeping me informed, and in that moment, I realized something profound: their rules, their presence, and even their reputation for being strict had never been about control. It was about creating a network that could respond to emergencies quickly, ensuring that residents were never left to handle crises alone. And as I glanced around my slightly soggy kitchen, I felt a wave of gratitude and humility, because I had spent so much time fearing these people when, in reality, they were quietly, consistently, and effectively looking out for everyone. So, once the repairs were underway, the HOA members didn't just leave, they stayed for a while, chatting with me about other practical precautions I could take, like checking water valves and drains regularly, offering their contact for any future concerns, and even suggesting a small neighborhood group that helped each other with home maintenance tips. And the more I listened, the more I realized that every interaction, every guideline I had thought was overly strict, had a hidden layer of care and foresight, a system built not to punish, but to prevent problems and to foster a sense of shared responsibility and mutual support among neighbors. Later that evening, as I sat with a cup of tea and watched the repaired ceiling dry in the warm glow of the sunset, I thought back to the first day I had moved in, the warnings I had overheard, the rumors I had believed, and I laughed quietly to myself, amazed at how completely my perception had shifted, because here I was, having survived what could have been a disastrous situation, and it wasn't luck or my own frantic problem-solving that had made the difference. It was the HOA, stepping in with kindness, experience, and genuine concern, showing me that they weren't just administrators or enforcers, but a lifeline, a quiet, steady presence that turned moments of fear into moments of relief. Over the next few hours, they even helped me contact a few neighbors who had previously dealt with similar leaks, sharing tips, offering extra tools, and reassuring me that this wasn't a situation to be embarrassed about. And I realized that the community they fostered wasn't just about rules, it was about connection, about creating a network of people who looked out for one another. And the thought made my chest tighten with appreciation, because every interaction I had had with them now carried new meaning. Every letter, every subtle gesture, every seemingly small instruction was part of a larger picture of care and protection, a picture that I was only beginning to see in its entirety. That night, as I lay in bed, exhausted but grateful, I reflected on how fear and assumption had clouded my first impressions, how I had expected judgment, scolding, and cold bureaucracy, and instead I had found empathy, practical assistance, and unwavering support. And I realized that this neighborhood, with its meticulously organized HOA, wasn't just a place to live. It was a place where kindness was built into the foundation, where rules and care existed hand in hand, and where even moments of crisis became opportunities to witness compassion in action. And as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but feel a new sense of anticipation, eager to see what other surprises awaited, what other ways this HOA would continue to defy my expectations, because if their response to one sudden plumbing disaster was any indication, I knew I was only scratching the surface of how deeply their generosity and thoughtfulness ran. A few days after the plumbing incident, the HOA invited me to a small neighborhood gathering at the community park, and I wasn't sure what to expect, part of me bracing for a stiff, formal event filled with rules and lectures. And yet, from the moment I arrived, it was nothing like that. The park was buzzing with life, kids running around on the swings, neighbors chatting in clusters, everyone smiling and waving, and the HOA members were moving through the crowd with easy familiarity, checking in on families, carrying snacks for the kids, and helping set up a few folding tables without ever appearing officious or demanding. And as I walked through the event, I started noticing small acts of thoughtfulness everywhere, like a board member kneeling down to tie a little girl's shoelace, another quietly offering water to a jogger who had stopped to rest, and someone else arranging chairs for an elderly couple so they could sit comfortably and enjoy the sunshine. And it all struck me as profoundly different from the image of a rigid, rule-enforcing HOA I had carried in my mind since moving in. I found myself drawn to a conversation with one of the senior board members who shared how they approached the neighborhood, explaining that their reputation for strictness came from caring deeply about safety and harmony, and that many of their rules Curb appearances, fence heights, landscaping guidelines were designed not to control, but to prevent hazards, protect property, and create a welcoming environment for everyone. And the more he talked, the more I realized that every small act I had witnessed, every envelope and letter I had received, and every instance of hands-on assistance was part of a larger philosophy that prioritized human connection and compassion over bureaucracy. And suddenly the pieces clicked together in a way I hadn't expected, revealing a hidden layer of generosity behind the facade of authority. As I wandered through the park, I noticed several neighbors I had never met before joining in the laughter and conversation, some helping with the setup, others organizing a small game for the kids, and each interaction carried a sense of genuine warmth that I hadn't anticipated from a community overseen by a so-called strict HOA. And I began to understand that this organization's influence wasn't about instilling fear. It was about fostering trust, connection, and support, creating a space where residents could rely on one another and the board to ensure their well-being. Part of the event included a surprise recognition ceremony, where a few neighbors were quietly acknowledged for acts of kindness, volunteering or simply helping out during recent emergencies, and seeing the smiles, the light in their eyes, and the way the HOA members personally handed out small gifts or certificates, I felt a deep sense of admiration and surprise, because it became clear that their strict rules were balanced with sincere appreciation for people's efforts and contributions, and that this blend of accountability and encouragement was what made the neighborhood truly thrive. While chatting with a few new neighbors, I learned about their experiences over the years, how the HOA had helped coordinate home repairs, organized neighborhood watch programs, supported families during medical emergencies, and even provided resources for people who were going through financial difficulties. And the more stories I heard, the more I realized how much effort went unnoticed, how the organization quietly touched lives in ways that didn't make headlines, but made a real difference. And it made me reflect on how my initial fears were so completely misplaced. At one point, a neighbor came over and invited me to join a small group helping to plant flowers around the park. And I hesitated at first, feeling a little shy, but quickly found myself swept into the camaraderie, laughing as we muddied our hands in the soil, sharing stories about our homes, our families, and our reasons for moving here. And the HOA members were right there with us, kneeling in the dirt, offering guidance and encouragement, never separating themselves as authority figures, but participating fully as neighbors and mentors, showing by example how invested they were in creating a thriving, connected community. By the time the afternoon sun began to dip, casting a warm golden glow over the park, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't anticipated, as if layers of doubt and apprehension were peeling away, replaced by genuine gratitude, curiosity, and even excitement about being part of this community. And I realized that the HOA's strictness had never been about control at all. It had always been about fostering a safe, supportive, and compassionate environment, and now, seeing it in action on a larger scale, I felt a mixture of awe and relief. Before I left, one of the board members came up to me personally and thanked me for attending, asking how I was settling in and if there was anything they could do to help with my home or neighborhood integration. And as we talked, I understood that their attention to detail, their readiness to step in during emergencies, and their emphasis on inclusivity weren't isolated incidents. They were deliberate, thoughtful practices built into the culture of this HOA, practices that made a tangible difference in people's daily lives. Walking back home later, I looked at the houses lining the street, the carefully maintained lawns, the children waving from their porches, and I realized that I was living in a place where compassion was organized, where kindness had structure, and where community wasn't just a word on paper. It was actively nurtured, protected, and celebrated. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood that my early assumptions, the warnings and rumors I had taken seriously, had all been misleading. Because the HOA wasn't a threat at all. They were the glue that held the neighborhood together, quietly ensuring everyone's safety, happiness, and inclusion. And as I stepped inside my house and looked out the window one last time that evening, I felt a sense of anticipation for what was to come, wondering how else this unexpected kindness would reveal itself, what new surprises awaited, and how much more I would discover about the people and practices that had completely reshaped my understanding of what an HOA could truly be. Because if this one event was any indication, the story was far from over. And I had a feeling the next chapter would be even more heartwarming and revealing than anything I had experienced so far. By the time the weekend rolled around, I felt like I finally understood the rhythm of the neighborhood, the subtle ways the HOA worked behind the scenes, and the unspoken rules that weren't really rules at all, but rather gentle guides to keeping life smoother and safer for everyone. And I realized that my initial skepticism and fear had completely melted away, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude and admiration that I couldn't ignore. Earlier that week, I had been invited to a small volunteer day organized by the HOA, where residents came together to clean up the park, plant flowers, and organize a little food drive for families in need. And while I was nervous at first about participating, unsure of whether I'd be welcome or if I might accidentally break some rule the moment I arrived, I was greeted with warm smiles, introductions, and an immediate sense of inclusion. And it struck me how effortless their kindness was, how genuine the encouragement felt, and how quickly the air of tension I had carried since moving in completely vanished. As I joined a group of neighbors tidying up the flower beds, one of the board members approached me, handing me gloves and a small trowel, and as we worked side by side, he explained how these gatherings were a way not only to maintain the neighborhood, but also to connect people, build relationships, and make sure no one ever felt isolated, which was especially important in a community with families, elderly residents, and newcomers. And every sentence he spoke carried a sincerity that made me reflect on just how much thought and heart went into everything the HOA did, and how different it was from the stories I had been told. Later, while we paused for a quick break, another board member called me over to see a small project they had been quietly organizing. A community lending library and toy swap corner for kids, designed to give families access to resources they might not be able to afford. And as I watched the smiles on children's faces, the way parents thanked the HOA for caring about even the tiniest details of their lives, I felt an overwhelming sense of connection and appreciation, realizing that the reputation of strictness I had feared was only a surface layer, masking a deep commitment to compassion and service. And it made me laugh quietly to myself, thinking about how many times I had worried about letters or rules, when in reality, those same people were quietly creating opportunities, solving problems and spreading kindness throughout the neighborhood without fanfare or expectation of recognition. The rest of the day unfolded in a series of small, heartwarming moments that left me astonished and grateful. Neighbors helping each other carry heavy bags, the HOA coordinating a schedule for people who wanted to join in but weren't sure when they'd be free, and even a small group of volunteers going door to door to check on elderly residents who hadn't been able to come out to the park, making sure they had everything they needed. And each time I witnessed these acts, I felt my respect for the organization deepen, because it was clear that their efforts were rooted in genuine care rather than obligation. By the afternoon, as the sun cast long golden shadows across the neatly kept lawns, I found myself chatting with several longtime residents who shared stories of past challenges, storms, plumbing disasters, neighborhood conflicts, and how the HOA had always been there, quietly intervening, mediating, and providing support in ways that were almost invisible but always effective. And I realized that their presence was like an invisible safety net, catching problems before they became crises, and that this proactive approach to community management was far more impressive and meaningful than any rulebook or bylaw I had imagined. As the day drew to a close, the HOA members gathered everyone for a brief informal thank you, expressing appreciation for the volunteers and highlighting small victories. The garden looking better than ever, donated items distributed to families, and a few kids excitedly clutching books and toys from the new lending library. And watching them speak with such genuine pride and joy, I understood that their dedication wasn't about authority or control. It was about fostering connection, happiness, and security, and that the strictness people often feared was simply the framework that allowed these acts of kindness to flourish consistently across the entire neighborhood. Walking home later that evening, carrying a small potted plant I had helped pot for the community garden, I felt a profound shift in my perspective, thinking about how far my assumptions had come, from nervous dread about a controlling HOA to admiration for a group of people who had quietly transformed the way I thought about community, responsibility and kindness. And I realized I had never experienced anything quite like it, a place where rules and care coexisted in harmony, where every decision was made with the welfare of residents in mind, and where even small everyday gestures carried meaning and impact. By the time I reached my front porch, I felt a deep sense of belonging, a realization that I wasn't just living in a neighborhood with a governing body. I was part of a community where the HOA's role was to nurture, protect and support, and as I looked out at the street, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. The very organization I had feared, imagined as a source of stress and judgment, had become a source of comfort, guidance, and unexpected friendship. And I felt a renewed sense of excitement and curiosity, wondering what other moments of kindness and community building lay ahead. Because if this weekend was any indication, the story of my HOA's compassion was far from over, and I knew that the next chapter would reveal even more ways in which their quiet, thoughtful care shaped the lives of everyone around me. By the final week of settling in, I felt a profound sense of connection and gratitude that I hadn't anticipated when I first moved to the neighborhood. I couldn't help but reflect on the journey from suspicion to appreciation, remembering the nervous excitement of my first day. The carefully folded welcome letters, the helpful advice, and the countless small gestures that had slowly dismantled my preconceived notions about what an HOA could be, because I had truly expected a group of stern rule enforcers who thrived on pointing out mistakes, and instead I had discovered a community of thoughtful, caring people whose every action seemed designed to foster safety, happiness, and inclusion. It was more than just policy. It was a philosophy, a living, breathing network of support that quietly lifted everyone around them. That week, I was invited to participate in a community project that seemed simple on the surface, organizing a mini food drive for local families, but quickly revealed the depth of the HOA's commitment to kindness and connection. Every step of the process was carefully coordinated, from making sure donations reached the families who needed them most, to arranging volunteers in a way that allowed newcomers like me to feel included without feeling overwhelmed, and even small details, like providing snacks and water for the volunteers, were thoughtfully considered, showing that the HOA thought not just about the big picture, but about every individual involved. As I handed out supplies alongside board members and longtime neighbors, I observed how naturally they guided interactions, checking in on everyone, answering questions patiently, and offering assistance with a warmth that felt effortless yet deeply genuine. And I realized that the organization's reputation for being strict had never been about control. It had been a framework that enabled this very compassion to operate efficiently, ensuring no one was overlooked or left behind, and that every rule, guideline, and procedure served the greater purpose of protecting and supporting the people who called this neighborhood home. Later, as we gathered the leftover items and shared a few laughs about small mishaps during the distribution, one of the board members pulled me aside to talk about the neighborhood's vision, explaining how they wanted every resident to feel both safe and empowered, to know that help was available without judgment, and to understand that the HOA's efforts extended beyond property and aesthetics into the very fabric of community life. And as I listened, I felt a sense of awe at the thoughtfulness and foresight behind everything I had witnessed since moving in, from the friendly letters and surprise gifts to the emergency assistance and volunteer coordination. It all fit into a larger, beautifully orchestrated tapestry of care. Walking back home later that day, I noticed neighbors stopping to chat, offering friendly nods and small updates on their families, and I reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. My fear had been replaced by curiosity, my skepticism by trust, and my isolation by a sense of belonging, and I realized that the HOA's true power wasn't in enforcing rules. It was in creating an environment where people naturally looked out for one another, where support and kindness were the norm, and where even the smallest actions, like helping with a dripping faucet or guiding a child safely across the street, carried profound significance, weaving the community together in a way that was both subtle and transformative. That evening, As I settled onto my porch with a cup of tea and watched the street glow in the soft light of dusk, I reflected on how far I had come from the anxious newcomer who had worried about letters, inspections, and fines. I smiled at the irony that the very institution I had feared had become one of my greatest sources of reassurance, joy, and community connection. I thought about the countless moments that had quietly shaped my experience: the surprise envelopes, the volunteer events, the emergency support, the laughter shared with neighbors. I realized that each moment had built on the last, creating a steady arc from suspicion to admiration, and from isolation to inclusion. Finally, as the neighborhood settled into the calm of the evening, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the people behind the HOA, for their foresight, their patience, and their unassuming dedication, because I had come to understand that their work wasn't just administrative, it was human, compassionate and impactful in ways that weren't always visible, yet were deeply felt by everyone fortunate enough to live here. And for the first time, I truly appreciated what it meant to have a governing body that prioritized the well-being of its residents over appearances or reputation, transforming the idea of an HOA from something to fear into something to respect, admire, and even cherish. And as I looked down the street at neighbors chatting, kids playing, and small acts of everyday kindness unfolding all around, I realized that I had not just moved into a neighborhood, I had become part of a living, breathing example of community at its very best, and I knew that this experience would stay with me forever. A reminder that sometimes the things we fear most have the potential to surprise us in the most wonderful, heartwarming ways.